The galaxy stretched endlessly around her as if it wanted to swallow her whole, but Lyra refused to stop because she knew the human was somewhere out there and she had already come too far to turn back now. Her ship was small and old, and every system inside it hummed with the sound of strain from months of nonstop travel through countless star systems, yet she pushed it harder, each day hoping that the next jump would finally bring her closer to the human she had been chasing. Lyra's green eyes scanned the holographic maps before her, and she tapped the screen with restless fingers trying to make sense of the scattered signals that her sensors had collected. There were rumors, whispers in hidden ports and black markets, that a lone human had been spotted moving from one remote world to another, always staying ahead of those who pursued him. Most believed humans were myths or long extinct in this part of the galaxy, but Lyra knew the rumors were true. She could feel it like a fire in her chest that burned brighter with every light year she traveled. The universe had not been kind to her during this search. She had wandered through barren moons where the air was too thin to breathe and dense jungle worlds where every plant and creature wanted her dead. She had bargained with smugglers, traded away weapons and supplies, and even risked walking into outlaw territories where strangers eyed her like prey. Every step of the journey had tested her resolve, but she endured because the human meant something far greater than her own life. She never told anyone the true reason why she hunted him. The secret stayed buried deep within her heart, locked away behind layers of control, because if anyone found out the truth, they would stop her at any cost. She carried the weight of her entire species on her shoulders, and she could not afford failure. Now, as the ship's engines roared into another jump, Lyra leaned back in the worn pilot seat and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember what hope used to feel like. She thought of the faces of her people back home, the children who would never grow to see another sunrise. If she failed, and the promise she had made to herself before leaving that she would return with the human, no matter the cost. The ship emerged from hyperspace near a desolate star system, and the sensors immediately lit up with warning lights because the area was crawling with pirate ships and scavenger drones. Lyra tightened her grip on the controls and maneuvered through the debris field, weaving between rusted hulks of abandoned freighters. Her ship rattled from the turbulence, but she pressed forward, her eyes darting between the screen and the void outside. Somewhere in this forgotten corner of the galaxy, she believed she would find her next clue. She landed on a dusty outlaw world, where the air shimmered with heat and the ground was nothing but cracked stone and jagged metal ruins. The settlement ahead was a collection of makeshift shelters and broken towers, all held together by desperation. Figures in ragged armor watched her as she stepped off her ship, their faces hidden behind breathing masks. Lyra ignored their stares and walked into the narrow streets, scanning for the information broker she had been told about. Inside a dimly lit tavern filled with the smell of burnt fuel and stale drinks, she found the broker hunched over a table of flickering data screens. The creature's voice was like gravel as it asked what she wanted, and Lyra placed a small glowing crystal on the table as payment. The broker's eyes widened at the sight of it, because the crystal was worth more than most ships, but Lyra did not care. She only wanted the information. The broker tapped at the screen, and after a moment it told her a human had indeed passed through the planet weeks ago. He had been looking for a transport ship to take him deeper into uncharted space, but had left in a hurry when mercenaries began to close in. The broker gave her a single name of the ship he had boarded and a vague direction of its course. Before disappearing into the shadows with the crystal, Lyra felt the first flicker of real hope in months. She left the tavern quickly and returned to her ship, but the sense of relief did not last long because she knew she was not the only one looking for the human. Already she could see mercenary scouts watching her from the rooftops, their weapons ready. She sprinted up the ramp of her ship and sealed the hatch just as blaster fire erupted behind her. The ship shuddered as shots hit the hull and alarms blared. But she powered the engines and lifted off the ground, throwing the vessel into the sky. Enemy ships launched after her, their engines glowing bright as they tried to close the distance. Lyra pushed her vessel harder than it was ever meant to go, the controls vibrating beneath her hands as the stars stretched into lines. She barely escaped the planet's gravity and launched into hyperspace moments before the mercenaries could destroy her. Her breath came in heavy gasps and her hands trembled, but she forced herself to focus on the navigation screen where the coordinates from the broker now blinked softly like a beacon. She had a lead, a direction, a real chance to find the human at last. The journey was far from over, but the fire in her chest burned stronger than ever. Somewhere out there in the cold depths of the galaxy, the human was waiting, and Lyra knew she would not stop until she reached him. The stars outside the ships viewports shimmered like distant sparks as Lyra pushed her vessel deeper into the unknown reaches of the galaxy. She could feel the engines straining beneath her command, but there was no time to slow down because every second that passed meant the mercenaries might be closing in on the same lead she now carried, and she could not allow that to happen, not when she had come this far. She stared at the faint set of coordinates glowing on the navigation screen, knowing they would lead her to a system on the edge of the mapped galaxy, a place so remote it was often whispered about only in fear. Traders called it the Shard Ring because of the endless fields of shattered asteroids that circled its lone sun. Anyone who entered risked being torn apart by the debris, but that danger only made Lyra more certain the human would be there. It was the perfect place to hide. Journey through hyperspace stretched endlessly, and Lyra sat in the cockpit, listening to the hum of the ship. While her mind replayed the words of the broker, she remembered the way his voice had dropped when he confirmed the human had left the outlaw world in a hurry, chased by mercenaries. Just as she now was, she wondered what the human was running from, and why so many powerful forces wanted to capture him alive. She did not yet know the full reason, but she understood. The human was special, too valuable to be left in enemy hands, and that knowledge gave her resolve when the ship dropped out of hyperspace. The sight before her was breathtaking. The Shard Ring was like a frozen storm of broken rock and ancient wreckage drifting slowly around a pale golden star. Jagged pieces of asteroids collided softly in the distance while massive derelict ships floated in silent graves. The navigation system flickered with warnings and static because the radiation and magnetic interference made it nearly impossible to plot a safe path through. Lyra tightened her grip on the controls and guided her vessel forward, weaving between fields of tumbling debris, each fragment larger than her ship. One mistake would mean certain death, but she was calm, her senses sharp and focused. She had trained for missions like this, though none had ever been so personal. Deeper she went, the darker the space became. The sunlight from the distant star barely touching the shadows around her, and in that darkness she spotted faint energy signatures ahead. They were weak but unmistakable signs of life clinging to one of the larger asteroid fragments. She maneuvered closer until she could make out a makeshift settlement clinging to the rock like a nest. It was built from salvaged metal and broken hulls with faint lights glowing from within. Lyra knew the human might be there, but she also knew it would not be easy to reach him. Settlements like this were filled with scavengers and hunters, people who would sell anyone for the right price. She landed her ship quietly on the edge of the settlement and stepped out, her boots crunching softly on the dusty surface. The air was thin but breathable, and the silence around her carried a weight that made her instincts scream. As she walked deeper into the settlement, she kept one hand near her sidearm, scanning the shadows for movement. Figures moved around her in the narrow passageways, their faces hidden by helmets and masks, but their eyes glinting with suspicion. Everyone here was dangerous, and everyone here could betray her at any moment, yet she pressed forward until she reached a central hub where a worn-out station powered by unstable generators flickered with light. Inside the hub she found traders and outlaws gathered around a bar exchanging goods and information. She slipped among them, listening carefully for any mention of the human. It took hours of subtle questioning and careful observation, but finally she overheard a hushed conversation between two armed scavengers. They spoke of a man who had arrived only a few days ago, wounded, desperate, seeking transport further beyond the shard ring. They said he had something everyone wanted, but he had refused to trade it even when his life was threatened. Lyra approached them quietly, offering payment for their information. They looked at her suspiciously, but the credits she placed on the table were enough to loosen their tongues. They told her the human had boarded a small transport ship bound for a derelict space station hidden in the uncharted regions beyond the ring, a place even they would not dare go because it was said to be cursed. She thanked them, but as she turned to leave, she noticed a group of mercenaries entering the hub, their armor black and reflective, their weapons ready. Lyra recognized the insignia on their shoulders, the same faction that had chased her from the outlaw planet. They were already hunting for the same information. She slipped into the shadows and moved quickly through the narrow corridors of the settlement, her heart pounding as the mercenaries began questioning the scavengers. She could hear the sharp commands and the sound of weapons being drawn, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered she had been there. Back at her ship, Lyra powered the engines and lifted off the asteroid just as the mercenaries realized she was gone. Their ships ignited and pursued her through the maze of spinning rocks, deadly pieces of debris smashing against their hulls as they closed the distance. Lyra pushed her ship to its limits, diving through narrow gaps in the shattered field until her pursuers were forced to break formation or be destroyed. She could feel the tension rising inside her chest as she neared the edge of the ring, the coordinates to the derelict station flashing on her display. The mercenaries were still behind her, though their numbers were fewer now after several of them had been torn apart by the debris field. She activated the hyperdrive at the last possible moment, and the ship leapt forward into the void, leaving the enemy behind as the stars stretched around her. She gripped the console tightly, thinking of the human. She was now closer than ever, but danger was closing in on both of them, and she knew the next encounter would decide everything. The stars shimmered faintly around the small vessel as it emerged from hyperspace into the black silence of uncharted space. Lyra leaned forward in the pilot seat and stared at the vast emptiness that greeted her, the navigation console flickering weakly as it struggled to map the unknown. The journey from the shard ring had pushed her ship to the edge of its limits, and the engines now hummed with a strained, uneven rhythm, but she could not stop because she was closer than ever to the human, and her mission was the only thing keeping her moving. She adjusted the course toward the coordinates given to her by the scavengers, and soon a shadow appeared ahead in the distance. A massive derelict space station floating like a ghost among the stars, its structure cracked and twisted as if it had survived some ancient disaster. Pieces of metal drifted lazily around it, held together only by the station's weak gravitational field. Faint lights flickered across its outer shell, but many sections were completely dark and lifeless. It was the kind of place no one would willingly visit, a graveyard waiting for intruders. Lyra knew the human had come here, and she understood why this station was the perfect hiding place. No one would dare follow him into such a place except for her. She guided the ship slowly into the docking bay, navigating around chunks of frozen debris and dead machinery, until she reached a platform stable enough for a landing. The moment the ship touched down, she felt the weight of silence settle on her shoulders. The air outside would be stale and cold, but breathable enough for short periods. She equipped her suit and stepped out, her boots echoing across the hollow bay. The interior of the station was a labyrinth of broken corridors, flickering lights, and long forgotten rooms filled with the remnants of lives long past. She moved quietly, every sense alert for danger. She could feel the station's age in every step. Metal groaned under her feet, as if it might give way at any moment. She wondered how the human had survived in such a place with no proper supplies or functioning systems. As she explored deeper into the station, memories began to press into her mind, uninvited. She remembered the day she had first learned about the human and the promise of what his existence could mean for her people. Her world had already been dying a slow death, their population shrinking each cycle because of a genetic failure. They could not cure entire families lost with no hope of rebuilding. She had looked into the eyes of children who would never see adulthood, and she had sworn that, if there was even the smallest chance to save them, she would find it. The human was the only chance left his genetic code carried. Something ancient and powerful, something that could restore what her people had lost. And though she had never met him, she carried the weight of his importance with every breath. She paused in a corridor where the ceiling had collapsed, forcing her to crawl through a narrow gap on the other side. She emerged into a wide chamber, once used as a control room. The consoles here still glowed faintly with residual power, and she began searching for any sign of the human. Her heart racing with each step. She knew she was close. She could almost feel it. A sound behind her made her spin, quickly drawing her sidearm, but it was not a mercenary or scavenger. It was the station itself, shifting under its own decay. She steadied her breathing and pressed on, moving into another hall where the temperature dropped sharply, the walls covered in frost and condensation. She could see footprints in the thin layer of ice, small signs of movement, fresh enough to give her hope. She followed the tracks through a series of rooms until she reached a sealed door, its control panel still active. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand on the scanner. The door slid open with a grinding noise, revealing a dimly lit chamber where a single figure stood at the far side. The human was there. He was tall but thin, his body showing the signs of exhaustion and hunger, his clothes torn and his eyes alert. As they locked onto her, he raised a makeshift weapon in his trembling hands, demanding to know who she was and why she had followed him. Lyra kept her weapon lowered and took a slow, careful step forward, speaking calmly. She told him her name and said she meant no harm, but the human did not believe her, his voice sharp with fear and anger. He said too many others had already tried to capture him, and he would not let her take him like they had tried. She could see how much he had endured in his expression, the suspicion, the pain, the loneliness, and she knew words alone would not be enough to earn his trust. Before she could respond, a deep rumble shook the station, dust falling from the ceiling as the walls vibrated with the force of engines. Outside, the mercenaries had arrived, their ships latching onto the station with magnetic clamps. They were coming for the human, and they would kill her without hesitation. The human's eyes widened as the reality of the situation became clear. He turned his gaze back to Lyra, uncertain whether she was an enemy or a potential ally. She stepped closer and told him they had no time to argue. If they stayed, they would both die. She offered him her hand and promised she would explain everything if he came with her. Hesitated for only a moment before lowering the makeshift weapon and nodding. She felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived, because the sound of armored boots echoed down the corridor behind them. The mercenaries were inside the station and closing fast. Lyra led the human out of the chamber and into the twisting corridors, moving as quickly as they could while the station crumbled around them. Blaster fire echoed in the distance, and the human stumbled several times, his injuries slowing him down, but she would not leave him behind. She supported his weight and pushed forward, guiding him toward the docking bay where her ship waited. By the time they reached the final stretch, the sound of pursuit was right behind them, and she could feel the mercenaries' presence like a shadow breathing down her neck. They would not stop until they had the human, and Lyra knew she would have to fight to protect him. But as they ran, the human finally asked the question that had been building inside him since the moment they met. Why had she traveled so far, risking everything to find him? He demanded to know the truth. Lyra felt the words catch in her throat as they reached the edge of the bay, and she turned to face him for a brief moment. Her eyes filled with the weight of her mission and the desperation of her people. She told him she could not explain here, not yet, because they had to survive first, but she promised that once they were safe, she would reveal everything. The sound of blasters grew louder, and the glow of enemy armor lit the corridor behind them, and Lyra realized the next few minutes would Decide their fates, the corridor shook violently as blaster fire tore through the fragile walls of the derelict. Station pieces of metal flew in every direction, and the lights overhead flickered wildly as if the entire structure might collapse at any moment. Lyra grabbed the human's arm and pulled him forward, guiding him through the twisting path that led to the docking bay. Her breath came heavy from the weight of his injuries slowing them down, but she refused to let go because if they stopped for even a moment, the mercenaries would have them cornered. Behind them, the sound of armored boots echoed louder and louder. The mercenaries were relentless, shouting commands and unleashing another volley of shots that struck close enough to send sparks dancing across the floor. Lyra spun around, fired her weapon into the shadows, forcing them to scatter for cover, and then pushed the human onward again. He stumbled, but she steadied him, her determination burning as strong as ever. The docking bay finally came into view, but it was no safe haven because several mercenaries had already reached the platform they stood between. Lyra and her ship, weapons raised and ready to strike without hesitation. The human froze in fear at the sight of them, his grip tightening on her sleeve as though he knew they were trapped. Lyra's mind raced. There was no way to reach the ship without a fight, and if they hesitated even a second, they would die. She stepped forward, placing herself between the mercenaries and the human, her blaster steady as she exchanged fire with the enemy. The blasts lit up the bay like a storm of red and white lightning, each shot striking the walls around them. She dove behind a stack of crates, dragging the human with her. The crate shook violently as a blast exploded against it, sending fragments of metal into the air. Lyra could see the fear in the human's eyes, and she knew the truth could no longer wait. She turned to him and spoke, her voice urgent and raw. She told him that she had not crossed the galaxy to capture him or to use him for profit. She had come because his existence was the only chance. Her people had left. She explained that her species was dying a slow, unstoppable death, their population shrinking with each cycle because of a genetic flaw that no technology could repair. Their children were being born weaker each generation, and soon there would be none left at all. She told him that his bloodline carried something ancient and powerful, a key hidden deep within his DNA that could restore what her people had lost and give them a future again. She admitted that at first her mission had been only about survival for her species, but now, after seeing what he had endured and how far he had gone to escape those who sought to use him, she understood that he deserved more than to be treated as a tool. The human stared at her in silence, his face pale from both injury and shock. He had heard many stories about why the mercenaries wanted him, but he had never been told the full truth before. And now, as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he could see that she was not lying. The weight of her words pressed heavily on him, because he realized the decision she was asking him to make was not small. The mercenaries closed in again, and there was no more time for talk. Lyra rose from cover and unleashed a furious volley of fire, taking down two enemies in quick succession. The others returned fire, forcing her to dive to the side. The human crawled toward the edge of the bay, grabbing a piece of fallen metal and hurling it at one of the mercenaries, buying her a brief opening. She seized the moment, charged forward, and struck the remaining enemy with the butt of her weapon, sending him sprawling across the platform. With the path momentarily clear, Lyra dragged the human onto the ship and sealed the hatch. Behind them, she ran to the cockpit and powered the engines as enemy ships locked onto their position. Blasts struck the hull, shaking the vessel violently as it lifted off the platform. She pulled the controls hard, launching them into the void while the mercenaries gave chase. The stars streaked past as Lyra pushed the engines beyond their safety limits, alarms screaming in her ears. She could feel the ship straining against the forces pulling at it, but she refused to stop, not until they were safe. The human sat in the co-pilot seat, clutching his ribs and watching her with wide eyes. He finally asked the question that had been haunting him since she revealed the truth. What would happen to him if he gave her what she needed? Lyra hesitated, her hands trembling slightly on the controls before she answered. She told him the process would be dangerous because extracting the genetic key from his DNA required ancient technology that could not guarantee his survival. She admitted that she could not promise he would live through it, and the words hung heavy in the air. The human sat quietly for a moment, thinking about everything he had endured, all the running, all the pain, all the people who had tried to capture him for reasons he had not understood until now. He thought about the choice before him, knowing it could cost his life, but he also thought about the children. Lyra had spoken of children who might live if he agreed. The chase continued outside the enemy ships, firing relentlessly. One blast struck close enough to send a shudder through the entire vessel, and Lyra knew they could not outrun the mercenaries forever. They would have to make a stand soon. The human looked at her then, and she saw something change in his eyes. The fear was still there, but there was also a spark of resolve. He told her that if his choice could save an entire species, he was willing to take that risk. Lyra felt a swell of emotion she had tried so hard to keep hidden. She told him she would do everything in her power to keep him alive, and she meant it because he had become more than just a mission to her. He was now someone she would fight for until her last breath. As the enemy ships closed in, she set a course for the hidden sanctuary, where the ancient machines awaited. The final step in their journey lay ahead, and the outcome would decide not only the fate of her people, but the fate of the human who had just placed his trust in her. The stars burned bright as the ship leapt into hyperspace, and the mercenaries disappeared behind them. Lyra placed a hand on the console and closed her eyes, silently vowing that she would not let this sacrifice be in vain. The ship emerged from hyperspace into a silent region of space, where no star shone nearby, and the darkness stretched endlessly in every direction. Lyra stared through the viewport at a single structure floating in the void. An ancient station, larger than any she had ever seen. Its curved walls, covered in ruins, so old they had faded to shadows of meaning. It was the sanctuary her ancestors had spoken of in whispers, the place where the machines of creation still waited, untouched for countless ages. She guided the ship slowly toward the docking platform, her heart pounding as she thought of what they were about to do. The human sat in silence beside her. He looked exhausted, pale from his injuries and from the weight of the decision he had made, yet his eyes held a quiet determination that Lyra had come to respect. She knew he understood the danger better than anyone, but he had agreed to take the risk anyway, not for her, not for glory, but because he could not turn away from the thought of saving lives. He had never seen the docking clamps locked onto the hull, and the ship came to rest in the cradle of the sanctuary. The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed as though the void itself was holding its breath. Lyra helped the human stand, and together they stepped into the station's vast interior. The air was cold and carried a faint metallic taste, but it was breathable. The walls stretched high above them, glowing faintly with streams of energy that pulsed like the veins of a living thing. She led him to the heart of the sanctuary, where the ancient machines waited, their massive forms arranged in a circle around a single pedestal. The machines came alive as they approached, ancient sensors recognizing the presence of the human. Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine as the platform's glow intensified, and the hum of power filled the chamber. She turned to the human and told him this was the moment. Once the process began, there would be no turning back. The human nodded quietly. He removed the torn jacket he had worn for so long and stepped onto the pedestal, his posture straight and steady. Though she could see his hands tremble, Lyra moved to the control console and began activating the sequence. She could barely understand the ancient language of the machines, but the energy responded to her commands, rising in a crescendo that filled the chamber with blinding light. The human gasped as the machines reached into his genetic code, streams of energy surrounding him like a storm. His body lifted slightly from the pedestal, his face twisted in pain as the machines extracted the key that lay hidden deep within his DNA. Lyra called out to him, telling him to hold on. She could feel the fear tightening her chest, But she kept working, adjusting the sequence to keep the energy from overwhelming him. The chamber shook as the machines transmitted the extracted code to distant receivers on Lyra's world. Her people would now receive the cure, their failing genetics repaired by the gift the human had given them. She knew at that moment the future of her species was secured, and yet her heart was not at peace, because she could see the human weakening before her, the light around him flickering as his strength drained away. She rushed to the platform and reached for him, calling his name, but the machines would not release him until the process was complete. She could only stand helplessly as the final wave of energy surged through him, his body falling limp in the glow. Then at last the pedestal powered down, and he collapsed into her arms. Lyra held him tightly, praying he was still alive. His chest barely moved. With shallow breaths, she whispered to him, telling him it was over, that he had saved them all, and she would not let his sacrifice end this way. She carried him back to the ship with a strength she did not know she had once inside. She used every piece of medical equipment she could find, her hands trembling as she worked to stabilize him. Hours passed in a blur of effort and fear, until finally his breathing grew stronger, his heartbeat steadying under her touch. Relief washed over her so intensely she could hardly stand. She sat beside him as he slept, watching the lines of pain slowly fade from his face. She thought of the promise she had made, that she would not let this sacrifice be in vain, and she knew she had kept it. When the human finally woke, his eyes fluttering open in confusion, Lyra smiled softly and told him they had done it. Her people were saved, and he was the reason why. He stared at her for a long moment, as if he could not believe it was real. Then he asked quietly what would happen to him now. She told him the choice was his. She could take him back to her world, where he would be honored as a savior, his name spoken for generations, or she could help him return to the quiet life he had longed for, far away from those who might still wish to use him. She made it clear that his life was his own. Now no one would ever chase him again. The human thought about her words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the weight of fear lift from his shoulders. He chose to stay with her for a while, to see the world he had saved and to help guide her people into the future they had been given. He said he could not simply walk away from those lives when he now felt connected to them in a way he had never expected. Lyra felt a warmth rise in her chest at his decision. She guided the ship home with a steady hand, and when they arrived, her world was already changing. Children ran through the streets, laughter ringing through the air as families embraced, knowing their future was secure. Her people gathered to greet them, eyes filled with gratitude and awe at the sight of the human who had given them back their hope. As the sun set over the horizon, Lyra stood beside him, watching the golden light bathe their world in warmth. She told him that though he had saved her people, he had also saved her, because his courage had reminded her that hope was never truly lost, even in the darkest reaches of the galaxy. He looked at her quietly, and for the first time in many years, allowed himself to smile. The stars glittered above them as night fell, and Lyra knew the journey that had begun with a desperate search had led to something far greater than she had ever imagined. It was not only the survival of her species that had been secured, but also the bond between two lives that had once been strangers and now stood side by side, ready to face whatever the galaxy might hold. The end.